Ok, bueno, damos paso a la primera conferencia magistral de esta noche. Tenemos por Zoom y también conectado por Facebook al profesor Stephen Crowell, profesor de Filosofía y Humanidades. Obtuvo su doctorado en Filosofía por la Universidad de Yale. Sus áreas de interés incluyen la filosofía europea del siglo XX, especialmente la fenomenología de Edmund Husserl y su desarrollo en Heidegger, el existencialismo, Sartre, Merleau-Ponty, Levinas, Arendt, la hermenéutica, Gadamer, Ricoeur y el postestructuralismo, Derrida y Lyotard. También trabaja Kant, el idealismo alemán, los neokantianos alemanes, Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, temas de metafísica, metaética, filosofía de la mente, estética y filosofía de la historia. Ha coeditado con Sonia Rinofner-Kreidl de Graz, de Austria, Husserl Studies, y es editor fundador con Bert Hopkins del New Yearbook for Phenomenology and Phenomenological Philosophy. Entre sus múltiples trabajos ha publicado Normativity and Phenomenology in Husserl and Heidegger, el año 2013, ganador del premio al libro del Simposio Sociedad Canadiense de Filosofía Continental, 2014, y Husserl, Heidegger and the Space of Meaning, Paths Towards Transcendental Phenomenology, en el 2001. Es ganador del premio Edward Goodwin Ballard al mejor libro en fenomenología del 2002. Ok, 1 minute. No, wait. Ok, 107. Ok, we're immediately passing to the first keynote of these conferences with Stephen Crowell from Rice University. He's professor of philosophy and humanities at Rice University in Houston, Texas. He obtained his PhD in philosophy at Yale University. He specializes in 20th century European philosophy, especially the phenomenology of Edmund Husserl and its development in Heidegger, Sartre, Merleau-Ponty, Levinas, and Arendt. Hermeneutics, Gadamer, Ricoeur, and post-structuralism, Derrida, Lyotard. He has also written on Kant, German idealism, neo-Kantianism, Nietzsche, and Kierkegaard. He has systematic interest in metaphysics, metaethics, philosophy of mind, aesthetics, and philosophy of history. Crowell edited the Cambridge Companion to Existentialism in 2021, co-edited Husserl Studies with Sonia Rinofner-Kreidl of Graz, Austria, and is founding editor with Bert Hopkins of the New Yearbook for Phenomenology and Phenomenological Philosophy. His books include Normativity and Phenomenology in Husserl and Heidegger, in 2013, winner of the Symposium Book Award, Canadian Society for Continental Philosophy, 2014, and Husserl, Heidegger, and the Space of Meaning, Paths Towards Transcendental Phenomenology in 2001, which was winner of the Edward Goodwin Ballard Prize for the Best Book in Phenomenology 2002. Stephen Crowell va a leer ahora una conferencia en inglés. Los textos están repartidos en castellano. La versión castellana se va a proyectar en Facebook, creo. El texto que va a leer es Heidegger, Kant y la fenomenología de la razón finita. Heidegger, Kant and the Phenomenology of Finite Reason. Thank you, Steve, for coming to our conference, and you can start.
Thank you, Rosemary. It's a great honor for me to be able to participate in this event that you have organized, and to be with some of my friends in Lima once more, even though I'm not actually in Lima. This is a great topic for the conference, and I'm very interested to hear what people have been working on and thinking about the issues between phenomenology and the Kantian tradition. My talk today is one contribution to thinking about how phenomenology, and in particular Kant's first and second critique might influence one another or have influenced one another. And so I want to thank you, Rosemary, for the invitation to participate. And I'm anxious to hear what people might have to say. I put my my text on the screen just in case it's easier for people to follow. I apologize for not being able to deliver my talk in Spanish. That's one great regret I have in my life, especially living in Texas, where it would come in very handy to have some Spanish at my fingertips. But I'll go ahead with the English version, and I hope we'll get some discussion going. So my talk, as you can see, is titled Kant, Heidegger, and the Phenomenology of Finite Reason. And what I'm really interested in here is seeing how Heidegger, despite his criticisms of Kant, draws on Kantian ideas to develop his own approach to what I call normative questions, which I take to be central to Heidegger's work, although this is a somewhat controversial view among scholars of Heidegger. So we'll see how it goes. The quotations are all from, I hope they'll be clear enough where they're coming from. The citations are at the end of the paper, but I'm not going to try to explain every sentence. So let me begin. In a late text, Heidegger quotes Angelus Silesius, quote, "The rose knows no why. It blooms because it blooms, as an emblem of existence, untroubled by the principle of sufficient reason." Heidegger had already broken with philosophical tradition in Being and Time, defining Dasein, the entity which each of us is, as care, Sorge, rather than rational animal. Dasein, in whose being that very being is essentially an issue, is concerned for the meaning of its being, and only then for its rationality. So what becomes of reason in Being and Time? Because the literature often focuses on Heidegger's argument that rational discourse, or logos apophantikos, assertion, is not fundamental, it can seem that Heidegger rejects any important role for reason in the analytic of Dasein. But I will argue that while reason is not a constitutive element of care, Heidegger acknowledges reason giving as an ineliminable demand on authentic selfhood. Being and Time develops a normativity-first approach to reason, in contrast to the reasons-first approach to normativity found, for instance, in Kant. Kant establishes what norms are by the reasons we have for being bound by them, while Heidegger establishes what reasons are by locating their origin in our experience of normative force. To argue this point, I will draw on two further texts, roughly contemporaneous with Being and Time: On the Essence of Ground from 1928, and Kant and the Problem of Metaphysics from 1929. In the latter, Heidegger claims that Kant's project in the first critique corresponds in intention to that of Being and Time, namely to clarify what ontological knowledge is. According to Heidegger, this project demands a concept of pure sensible reason, and though Kant failed to deliver one, we can see, with some help from the 1928 essay, how Being and Time fills that lacuna. The first section is Heidegger's rejection of neo-Kantian approaches to the first critique. Early in Being and Time, Heidegger identifies two elements of our knowledge of beings: nous and logos, noein and legein. While Heidegger resists translating either term as reason, both enter into the traditional concept. Logos is reason in the sense of giving an account, logon didonai, an answer to the question why, and it involves asserting something about something. To adopt this sense of reason is to conceive truth as a property of propositions organized in a logical system of ground and consequent, governed by the principle of sufficient reason. This sense of what reason is gained prominence in Marburg Neo-Kantianism, which provides the foil for Heidegger's phenomenological reading of Kant. Reason in the sense of nous, in contrast, which Heidegger usually translates as Vernehmen, or perception, or Anschauung, intuition, is a discursively unmediated encounter with something, a truth whose opposite is not falsity, but unreceptivity. One either sees or one doesn't. In Aristotle, knowing reveals simple sense qualities, but it is also our access to the archai, or categories. Noetic reason is thus the source of ontological rather than ontic knowledge. Ontological knowledge is not concerned with the properties of beings and the relations among them, but with being, that which constitutes beings as being. While Neo-Kantian epistemology eliminates this noetic sense of reason, ostensibly on the authority of Kant's rejection of intellectual intuition, the phenomenological approach subordinates logos to nous. Husserl's principle of all principles, for instance, stipulates that each intuition affording something in an originary way is a legitimate source of knowledge, and no conceivable theory can make us stray from this principle, because any theory can draw its truth only from originary givenness. Being and time also follows this phenomenological path. All talk, all assertion and judgment is measured by seeing, by exhibiting directly and demonstrating directly. And Heidegger argues, in contrast to the Neo-Kantians, that the first edition of the Critique of Pure Reason's project of laying the groundwork for Metaphysica Generalis follows this path as well. Grundlegung is transcendental reflection concerned not so much with objects as with the kind of knowledge we have of objects, insofar as this is possible a priori. Kant likens this to the method of the natural scientists, who realize that reason has insight only into what it produces according to a plan of its own, Entwurf, thus constraining nature to answer its own questions. But Heidegger argues that critique has nothing to do with a theory of knowledge. Instead, it uncovers the way comporting toward beings, or ontic knowledge, is made possible by the preliminary understanding of the constitution of being, namely ontological knowledge. The transcendental question then concerns this preliminary understanding, or ontological knowledge, which Kant calls pure synthesis. Much of Heidegger's 1929 Kant book is devoted to elucidating pure synthesis as the projection, or Entwurf, constitutive of beings as beings, Dasein's ontological transcendence. While our focus will be on showing how ontological transcendence embodies the finite reason, or pure sensible reason, entailed by the synthesis of knowing and legging. In the first critique, knowing and legging appear as the two basic sources of the mind, sensibility and understanding. Sensibility is that through which alone something can be given, while understanding is that through which alone something can be thought. Kant conjectures that these two sources may have a common, but to us unknown root, and Heidegger develops this conjecture into an interpretation of transcendental imagination as the unity of knowing and legging. This should have led to a concept of pure sensible reason, but fearing that the primacy of logic in metaphysics might fall, Kant shrank back from his insight and subordinated imagination to understanding. In thus abandoning the first edition's phenomenology of ontological transcendence, Kant strayed from the path that leads to pure sensible reason. The way back to that path, according to Being and Time, lies in the phenomenology of comportment, or Verhalten. So, section 2, ontological transcendence and care. According to Heidegger, Kant holds that knowing is primarily intuiting, thus affirming the priority of nous over logos. But because human intuiting is merely receptive, its finitude and neediness must be surpassed by understanding or judging. This surpassing is unnecessary for a creative intuitus originarius, can only take the measure, in our case, of intuitively given things, rendering them accessible as something. This is what Heidegger calls ontic transcendence. Empirical science, Kant's paradigm of ontic transcendence, takes this measure according to a plan of its own, a theory. But the first critique aims to show that such empirical accessibility has an a priori ground in pure intuition, time as self-affection, and pure understanding, I think, or apperception. Together, these make up the totality of pure sensible reason. Thus, all ontic transcendence, all intentional directedness towards beings as beings, presupposes ontological transcendence, a projection that takes the measure of their being. In introducing this concept, Heidegger somewhat curiously turns to Kant's account of the practical self and its relation to practical reason. But this pivot proves decisive for the normativity first retrieval of reason in being and time. In the first critique, the self of pure apperception or self-consciousness is a mere thought, not an intuition. But things stand otherwise in the critique of practical reason, where self-consciousness is not a formal condition, but is intuited in the feeling of respect for the moral law. Moral feeling is the feeling of my existence, says Heidegger, as a practical being. And its analysis is said to illuminate the basic structure of the practical self's transcendence. How so? As feeling, pate or receptivity, respect indicates susceptibility to the law. Thus, respect is not a consequence of encountering the law, but rather the way in which the law first becomes accessible to us. In phenomenological terms, this means that I cannot grasp a law as a law, rather than merely a peculiar grammatical form, a deontological ought, without first being receptive to normativity, for instance, to the distinction between normative force and coercion. A law becomes accessible as a law only if I am able to feel myself bound to it. In having a feeling for the normative, the respecting I becomes manifest to itself as an acting self. Reason as free is autonomous. It gives to itself that for which the respect is respect. In subordinating myself to the law, I project myself to myself as the free creature which determines itself. Considered phenomenologically, then, respect is the manner of the self's being responsible, authentic being itself. And this, says Heidegger, is the essence of practical reason. Thus, the exercise of practical reason in deliberation, for instance, does not define being responsible, but is grounded in responsibility, the affective uptake of a normative claim which need not take the form of a law. As Heidegger puts it, neither the law, the norm, nor the acting self can be apprehended objectively. They are manifest in an original, unobjective, and unthematic way in duty and action. Later, we will see how these claims draw on Heidegger's phenomenological account of practical reason in being and time. But first, we should clarify their contribution to Heidegger's phenomenological framing of Kant's inquiry into the transcendental subject or self. According to Heidegger, Kant's question of how knowledge is possible presupposes a knowing subject that is not sure of itself, an essentially finite reason whose finitude is itself at issue in its being rational. This echoes being and time, where Dasein designates the entity who can raise the question of the meaning of being, such that its own being remains in question in all that it says and does. With this emphasis on finitude, Heidegger seeks to direct phenomenological reflection away from the knower toward a subject who stands toward the world, and so also toward itself, as something whose meaning is at issue in its comportment, at stake in its behavior. Defining the being of this entity as care, then, does not substitute one harmless categorical structure for another, namely Kant's pure apperception. It brings existence to light as a task, Zusein. Kant's project of Grundlegung is itself one of Dasein's ways to be, a practical identity in which Dasein tries to make its understanding of being phenomenologically explicit to itself. In the Kant book, and without explanation, Heidegger notes that the project of analyzing human finitude as the condition of possibility for the understanding of being requires an existential interpretation of conscience, guilt, and death. He provides the missing explanation in Being and Time, where these phenomena make up the pure sensible reason from which Kant shrank back. I will get to that in due course. So section 3, comportment as ontic transcendence. We must limit our reading to Being and Time to matters bearing directly on the question of whether the phenomenology of the care structure involves an essential role for reason. As noted earlier, Being and Time subordinates logos, or the logic of assertion, to nous, the seeing in which being is made available in its difference from beings. But highlighting the derivative character of apophantic discourse is not Heidegger's last word on reason as logos. Rather, reason as reason-giving, logon didonai, is grounded elsewhere than in the tradition's conception of the human being as a rational animal. Namely, it is grounded in the phenomenology of comportment. Being and Time introduces comportment in the context of a phenomenology of how things show up for us meaningfully as what they are in our practical dealings with them. Such dealings have their own kind of sight, Umsicht, circumspection, thanks to which, for example, the hammer I use to drive a nail is there as a hammer, rather than as an object with properties. Such sight does not require visually attending to the hammer. Indeed, the hammer shows itself as it truly is when it withdraws into its use. Nevertheless, circumspectively encountering the hammer as a hammer does require that it show up within a normative relevance totality, Bewandtnis Ganzes, involving other tools and the work to be done, such that I can experience the hammer as appropriate or inappropriate, suitable or unsuitable in various ways. Being a hammer, what it means to be one, is thus always already understood, more or less successfully, in such practical dealings. But to understand in this sense is not simply to possess the concept hammer. Possession of the concept, such that I might be able to reliably recognize hammers, does not allow me to grasp this hammer with the sight in which it shows itself as it is. Meaning in this sense is not conceptual, it is noetic, either seen or not seen, and it does not depend on my being able to give a true account, or logon didonai, of what it is to be a hammer. In Being and Time, comportment occupies a position of Kant's pure apperception or self-consciousness. In comportment, the self cites itself by trying to be something. Comportment is acting for the sake of some possibility of my own being, where possibility is neither logical nor physical, but ontological, an ability to be, sein können. For instance, if I have the skills necessary to accomplish what carpenters are supposed to accomplish, then I am able to be one. That is, I can use the tools available in such a way that they can show themselves in their fittingness for the task. Lacking such skills, I cannot be sensitive to when things are going well or badly. And so what a hammer is unavailable to me. But even if I have such skills, they will avail me nothing unless I act for the sake of being a carpenter, understand myself as a carpenter, by engaging in that practice here and now. Such practical understanding is an instance of what Heidegger calls Dasein's pre-ontological understanding of its own being. Acting for the sake of being something is ontic transcendence, and it can take many forms: trades and professions, personal relations, parent or friend, social roles, whether explicitly codified by, like being a senator, or only tacitly normed, like being a mentor, a hipster, or a celebrity, and so on. Many forms. So let us call these practical identities. The shape these identities take will vary with time and place, and the customary and legal norms pertaining to them will be familiar, publicly available at such times and in such places. But neither knowing what, for example, a teacher or father is supposed to do around here, nor being institutionally authorized to do it, is enough to make one a teacher or father. Dasein's practical identity is not a property. Rather, Dasein has this identity only in trying to be it, and in trying what it means to be what I am trying to be is always at issue. Thus, we might say that in place of the Kantian apperception, the I think, which must be able to accompany all my representations, Dasein is an I try that in fact does accompany my comporting myself for the sake of practical identity. Because the relevance totality at issue in comportment is initially understood in public or average way, based on the norms that hold in my time and place, I can challenge those norms as inappropriate, as not fitting for what I'm trying to be. In this sense, my self-understanding is always on trial and necessarily involves caring about doing justice to the norms of my practical identity. It is a practical matter whose success or failure is not measured by some temporally distant goal, but is measured at every moment in which I act for the sake of being something. An aspect of the normativity first character of Heidegger's phenomenological analysis shows itself here. I am responsible for the norms of teaching, not in the sense that I invent them, but in the sense that in binding myself to them, allowing them to exert normative force on my conduct, I'm also committed to what they entail about the normative relations among beings. For instance, the paraphernalia of teaching here and now, the relevance totality or world disclosed in acting for the sake of being a teacher. In short, I cannot try to be a teacher if I am indifferent to how things should be in the matter of teaching. Let us pursue this point a bit further. How does comportment enable the kind of sight or nous that pervades our practical dealings with things? In Heidegger's terms, acting for the sake of being a teacher or caring about what teaching is discloses the world of teaching, the significance pertaining to what it means to be a teacher. World disclosure allows things to show up as serviceable or unserviceable for what teachers do with them. The point is not that I'm originally confronted with a collection of mere objects, which I then throw a signification over. Rather, it is that comportment as ontic transcendence is self-understanding in the world, and so also a presumptive understanding of the being of things that show up there. So the nous that allows us to see or be sensible of the hammer's normatively constituted availability or significance is grounded in a nous in which I cite myself and disclosed to myself in light of the norms governing my current practical identity. For Heidegger, such sight is not an infallible intuition. Like everything else about Dasein, it is at issue in existence. But then this finitude or finitude of self-understanding might seem incompatible with the idea that nous is an all or nothing affair, where one either sees or does not see. Addressing this worry requires deeper examination of the phenomenological relation between care, Dasein's being an issue for itself, and the noetic self-citing in comportment. So, section 4 is now comportment as ontological transcendence. That relation is clarified in Division 2 of Being and Time, where the significance of Heidegger's allusion to the phenomena of anxiety, death, and conscience in Kant and the Problem of Metaphysics is fleshed out. For Heidegger, these are not, in other words, death, conscience, and anxiety are not independent variables. They belong to a single distinctive way in which Dasein is disclosed to itself, understands itself, and this way to be has both existential and methodological import. Its existential import lies in being the ground of one's ability to recognize a normative distinction between acting resolutely or irresolutely, authentically or inauthentically, within every comportment. Yeah, so all ontic transcendence. And its methodological import for the transcendental project of Grundlegung, it lies in its being the phenomenological evidence for ontological transcendence. The latter, following the parallel with Kant, is a pure or a priori ability to be that grounds empirical ontic transcendence. The structure of ontological transcendence becomes phenomenologically evident in the breakdown of all our everyday comportments. Heidegger describes Dasein as throne projection. Thrownness, Geworfenheit, or finding oneself, Befindlichkeit, in the midst of beings as a whole, is disclosed affectively, and Angst is the affect that belongs to breakdown. Because in Angst, everyday normative claims no longer move me effectively, the world can offer nothing more, and neither can the being with of others, and so nothing matters. All ontic comportment requires that I care about what it means to be what I'm trying to be. That is, it requires some level of commitment, of bindung. But Angst affectively undermines commitment. Further, because the meaningful availability of beings depends on my trying to be something, Angst undermines every relevance totality such that the world has the character of completely lacking significance. However, Angst seems to involve a paradox. If projecting an ability to be, that is, trying to be something, belongs to the ontological constitution of Dasein as throne projection, and if in the breakdown of all my commitments, I cannot comport myself toward any practical identity, as what do I understand myself? Heidegger answers this paradox with another. When all my abilities to be, teacher, father, citizen, are affectively disabled, I understand myself as inability to be, nicht mehr Dasein können. If Dasein were a thing with properties, this would make no sense. But in a being whose being is always at issue, Angst signals the finitude of its practical identities and elicits phenomenological evidence of its selfhood. The self-understanding that belongs to the phenomenon of breakdown is what Heidegger calls death, distinguishing this from all forms of ending of a life. Death is a way to be for Dasein, one in which I understand myself as solus ipse, I myself, without further qualification. All comportment, then, is being towards death, finite projection of what I am trying to be. This means that what is at issue in a particular comportment, say being a teacher, also includes what it means to be a self, full stop. The methodological role of Angst lies in bringing Dasein to this noetic grasp of its own being. To be a self is to be suspended between particular ontic commitments, practical identities, and their possible breakdown in such a way that I can either embrace the finitude of these commitments transparently, Durchsicht is Heidegger's word for noetic grasp of selfhood as such, or flee that finitude by treating my practical identities as properties, Eigenschaften, thereby concealing what is phenomenologically evident in the breakdown of ontic comportments. If this may suffice to suggest how death contributes to elucidating the structure of ontological transcendence, a question remains. On Heidegger's view, the meaning at issue in all comportment, all ontic transcendence, is articulated in discourse, Rede. If this is true for ontological transcendence as well, we seem to be faced with another paradox. Discursive articulation, the way I talk about what I am doing, normally depends on the world or relevance totality disclosed in my commitment to a practical identity and reflects the public character of such identities. But if all such worlds have collapsed in angst, it seems there could be nothing left to articulate. Heidegger addresses this paradox by exploiting the difference between selfhood and one's practical identities. The mode of discourse which articulates selfhood as such is the call of conscience. Conscience articulates the self-understanding achieved in death as inability to be. As the mode of discourse that speaks in the experience of breakdown, then, the call must have a character in every way opposite from that of engaged discursive practice. That is, it must give voice to how Dasein understands itself without the mediation of its practical identities. Now, what does selfhood really mean? So the call of conscience asserts nothing, provides no information, but instead has the character of a summons or Aufruf, a form of second-person address like Fichte's Aufforderung. Further, it is silent while losing nothing of its perceptibility, Vernehmbarkeit, hearing as noetic sensibility. Finally, what it communicates is unequivocal, immune to the pervasive ambiguity of everyday discourse. The call passes over what Dasein understands itself as, its practical identities, and what it counts for, can do, or concerns itself with in being with one another publicly, its persona. Still, it reaches the self unequivocally and unmistakably. What then does hearing the call give us to understand about that self? Heidegger answers, schuldig, guilty. But what's that supposed to mean? Being guilty cannot refer to anything I have done because the call addresses the self as inability to be without reference to any practical identity. For the same reason, the call is prior to the morally good and morally evil, making no reference to any law or ought. It neither warns nor reproves. Instead, it articulates the meaning of ontological transcendence as the phenomenological ground of ontic comportments. It is a logos that is also nous, pure, sensible reason. In Being and Time, Heidegger's term for ontological transcendence, the guilty heard in the call, is responsibility, Verantwortlichkeit. But we must attend closely to the second-person character of this term. Ontological transcendence is Verantwortlichkeit, answerability, the ability to answer to the call or summons which discloses what is at issue in being a self at all. For Heidegger, then, to be a self is to be answerable for oneself, beholden to a measure, norm, that is at issue in existing as such, namely authenticity, Eigentlichkeit, self only. Any comportment that issues from the call will thus involve the noetic citing of selfhood as such, falling somewhere between the transparent or durchsichtig or noetic attestation of my responsibility and the listening away from that responsibility, wherein I attempt to render myself unreceptive to the call. The phenomenological basis for retrieving reason in Being and Time is found in this notion of responsibility as answerability, where reason is not a constitutive feature of care, but is no less necessary for all that. If the possibility of breakdown shows that Dasein can be without being anything, that is, any practical identity, it also shows that Dasein, a self, cannot be anything without being answerable for what it does and says. So 5, it's retrieving reason in Being and Time. Now, let us admit that Heidegger's discussion of the call of conscience contains no reference to reasons or reason giving. Nevertheless, I have found no way to make sense of his description of being guilty except as the articulation of Dasein's responsibility for reasons, phenomenologically entailed by care as ontological transcendence. However, my defense of this claim will require interpreting a key passage in Being and Time's Phenomenology of Conscience through the lens of the account of reason found on the essence of ground. Heidegger begins by emphasizing that Dasein, as throne, always finds itself in the midst of beings over which it has no power. I can, of course, manipulate beings in various ways, just as I can resist my inclinations, motivations, and other psychological givens, but I cannot change the starting points, as it were, of such manipulation and resistance. I am delivered over, überantwortet, to them, not as something that has nothing to do with me, but as something I am, the facticity that belongs to the structure of care. Heidegger calls this the thrown ground, whose weight is disclosed affectively as a burden, that is, as mattering. On the essence of ground, this is the first form grounding takes, taking up a basis, or Bodennehmen. Dasein finds itself in the midst of beings as a whole, attuned to them affectively, such that they matter in one way or another. Though in the attunement of angst, beings do not matter, this is still a way of taking up a basis within beings as a whole. Nihilism. Thrownness, in turn, is that it is what it is, only together with Dasein's projecting itself on possibilities into which it has been thrown. That is, taking up and transforming the various practical identities that are available in my time and place. On the essence of ground, this is the second form that grounding takes, grounding as establishing, stiften. As we saw, my projection of the for the sake of, my commitment to a practical identity, establishes a world, freely lets the world prevail. In the phenomenon of breakdown, however, the only for the sake of that remains is death, the inability to be any identity, providing us with noetic insight into selfhood as such. Noetic self-understanding is grounding as establishing, because it belongs to all comportment as the freedom thanks to which Dasein can obligate itself, bind itself to a practical identity. In Being and Time's Phenomenology of Conscience, Heidegger describes grounding as establishing by saying that even though the self can never get its thrownness into its power as existing, that is, as projection, it must take over being a ground, commit to a practical identity. To be its own thrown ground is that ability to be, which is the issue, which is at issue for care, not just now and then, but essentially. So what does taking over being a ground mean? If what is understood in the call of conscience, namely being guilty, means that Dasein must take over being a ground, this is not a simple descriptive fact. Rather, in breakdown, Dasein is positioned second personally as the addressee of a summons or a command. You must take over being a ground. Any response to this command, any taking over, will be a projection of possibilities, the exercise of a particular norm-sensitive practical identity at which I can succeed or fail. In this way, Dasein makes its factical existence possible for itself. This, of course, does not mean that Dasein creates its facticity. It means only that in taking over being a ground, I possibilize the factic grounds into which I am thrown. Because Dasein is thrown, its taking over being a ground is finite. Dasein is jeweilig, belonging to a particular time and place where not every way to be is available. And it is also finite in being able to choose only one possibility at a time, commit to one practical identity. thus lending a binding character to what is projected. The finitude of my commitment, my being a ground, possibilizes the circumstances, naga, over which I have no power, the givens of my natural, historical, cultural, social, and psychological condition, into a normatively structured situation, involving grounds for which I am answerable, motivations that take the form of potentially justifying normative reasons, Gründe, for what I do and say. Thus, as Heidegger puts it in On the Essence of Ground, Dasein's being the addressee of a call to take over being a ground, namely grounding as establishing, requires a discursive response in which Dasein must account for itself. This is the third form of grounding, grounding as legitimation, Rechtgebung, or Logon. Rechtgebung provides the essential phenomenological link between reason giving and the care structure. As Heidegger describes it, legitimation is Ausweis, pointing out, demonstration, in which I propose, anführen, a being that then makes itself known as a cause or as a motivational ground, motive, for an already manifest nexus of beings. Such account giving can be done well or badly, but it is not optional. Rather, ontological transcendence, as taking over being a ground, is essentially being answerable for reasons. The finitude of care entails that no matter how I go on in comporting myself for the sake of being something, I will be exposed necessarily to the question, why in this way and not some other? Because what it means to be whatever it is that I'm trying to be, teacher, father, friend, is always at issue, my choice to go on in a certain way, the exemplar, forebuild of teaching that guides me, is inseparable from the question of why I should go on in this way. And the general form of an answer to such a question is that it is or seems best that I do so, namely a reason why, my reason. This interpretation is confirmed in On the Essence of Ground when Heidegger links the transcendence of Dasein to the good beyond being, epikeina theousias, in Plato. It is not by accident, he says, that the agathon is indeterminate with respect to its content, because when considered phenomenologically, Plato's hyperoranios topos is Dasein's ontological transcendence, where meaning, how best to go on in a practical identity, is never sure of itself, always at stake in acting. Dasein's sovereignty over itself as huhenika, for the sake of, its hexis toward what is best, is the source of possibility as such. But because such freedom is only in the choice of one possibility, choosing to go on in one way closes off other ways of going on, such that my legitimation itself, the recht of my reasons, remains at issue, essentially contestable, unsupported by any principle of sufficient reason. Finally, because all comportment is worldly and so involves being with others, my being responsible for reasons is equally being answerable for to those others for those reasons. Phenomenological examination of how Dasein understands itself when all its ontic comportments have collapsed, namely its noetic grasp of what it is to be a self, shows that Dasein is an entity whose being has to take over being a ground, in the threefold sense presented in On the Essence of Ground. All ontic comportment depends ontologically on finite freedom. Thus, taking over being a ground is fundamental comportment. So understood, freedom is pure sensible reason, and reason is established normatively. My response to hearing the demand, you must, constitutive of my being as care, brings reason as reason giving in its train. With this, we are in a position to answer the question left open in our earlier look at Heidegger's interpretation of Kant on the practical self and practical reasons. To what extent do the essential elements of Kant's account of practical reason show up in being and time? For Kant, it is in the feeling of respect, our susceptibility to the law, that the law first becomes accessible to us. While for Heidegger, it is through the affect of Angst that we are made aware of a normative demand or summons that is constitutive of our being. But for Heidegger, this demand does not stem from reason, and so does not take the form of a law. As a summons, it addresses me in the second person accusative. You must take over being aground. Act for the sake of what you take to be best in what you're trying to be. Such acting is not subject to the test of a categorical imperative, because in committing myself to what I take to be the best in whatever I'm trying to be, for instance, my exemplar of what it means to be a teacher, that meaning remains at issue for me. The indeterminacy of the agathon is thus necessary. Freedom, self-determination, is not legislation, but comportment, in which the acting self gives to itself that for which the respect is respect, namely, that meaning for which it is responsible in going on in a certain way. For Heidegger, as for Kant, the self's being responsible is the essence of the acting being itself, and indeed, it is practical reason. But for Heidegger, in contrast to Kant, practical reason is not limited to explicit deliberation, nor is it a monological assessment of the conformity of my maxim to the form of the law. It is a dialogical practice in which I account for myself, answer to others by giving and asking for reasons. We might put it this way. The phenomenological elucidation of the acting self and practical reason found in being and time shows that care is not governed in advance by a rule, but is the condition for any rule or law that can have normative force for me. Any such rule or law will be a function of how, in being answerable to others, I commit myself in response to the inescapable ontological demand that I take responsibility for the normative force of the norm at issue in my trying to be something. To a rationalist who embraces a reason's first account of normativity, this might seem to leave action guiding norms ungrounded, opening the door to decisionism and nihilism. But such a rationalist operates with an untenable concept of reason, one that presupposes the phenomenologically unsupported principle of sufficient reason, and so such a person can be safely ignored. Retrieving the place of reason in being and time, then, depends on adopting a normativity-first approach to reason. Norms are not normative because we have good reasons to adhere to them. There are no reasons until there is a being who is summoned to take over being aground, to answer for a particular way of going on. Responsibility is not measured by its accord with the law of reason. There can be a law of reason only because Dasein is answerable, a being whose life does not bottom out in a struggle for sheer survival, but is normatively at issue. That such an implication was left unsaid in being and time is of no concern, because what is left unsaid can, in fact, be said. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you very much. Okay, it was a very interesting, very interesting and intricate, compelling.
Yes, I apologize for the kind of dense character.
Yeah, it's dense, yes,
figure
but
out a
it's
way.
really interesting. Yeah. Okay. Well, I don't know. Perhaps we can open some questions. I don't know. Maybe you can. Somebody can ask in English. You all understand English. I mean, all our students have to have proficiency in English. So
Well, I do.
hope.
I
Yeah.
apologize for the
Okay.
complicated nature of the paper, but basically, what I really wanted to do is argue that there is a place for reason in being and time, which most people deny. So that's basically the argument.
Yeah. Okay. So we have a question from one of our students, Daniel Neira. Okay. Unfortunately, you cannot see him, but you can hear him. Okay.
Thank you, Professor Stephen, for your conference. It was very interesting for all of us, I think. You may excuse my English, but I have a little question, a very brief question indeed. You once said in the article, in Being and Time, I don't know how to say it in English, el comportamiento, comportment, I think you said, takes the position of pure apperception or self-consciousness in Kant. I really didn't get that. Could you, I don't know, explain it a little bit more? Because I don't see where's the
relationship.
Yeah, the relation. Yeah.
Yeah. Comportment, the term in Heidegger is Verhalten, sometimes translated as behavior, or but what the key point there that connects it with apperception or self-consciousness is that for Heidegger, comportment is a form of self-understanding. This is the concept I was using, practical identity. It is a mode of trying to be something. That is to say, I'm acting. It's can also be put in terms of Aristotle's notion of hu-heneke, or acting for the sake of being something. And so my self-consciousness in comportment is not a self-examination. It's not a reflective examination of what I'm doing. It is my self-understanding in the midst of what I'm doing. Right now, I'm giving a lecture, so I understand myself as a lecturer, and that informs how I behave in this particular context and how I respond to the things that show up in this context. So self-understanding is a practical form of the notion of apperception. For Kant, the apperception, pure apperception is, as he puts it, a thought only. We don't have any intuition of ourselves, according to him, as selfhood, as a self. It's just a principle that he uses to tie up the features of consciousness. But for Heidegger, we do understand ourselves precisely in the midst of action. We don't have to reflect on ourselves at all. It's pre-reflective self-understanding, which is a difference from Kant, in particular, from the Kant of the first critique. So there's, in the talk, I distinguish two forms of this kind of apperception, namely a self-understanding in a particular role. When I'm acting as a teacher, not when I'm thinking about it, but when I'm acting as a teacher or a father, trying to be one, do what fathers do. This is an ontic comportment and an ontic self-understanding. When I was trying to talk about ontological self-understanding or ontological pure apperception or pure grasp of the self in Heidegger, I turned to the phenomenon of breakdown, because that gives me not myself as a teacher or a parent or some practical identity, but purely it reveals to me the nature of selfhood as such. So it's a phenomenological version of what in Kant is only a thought. It can't, the self-apperception can't be intuited, and it's just a principle that holds everything together. But in Heidegger, my self-understanding can either be in a particular role, or it can be understanding in the phenomenon of breakdown, which, as I try to show, is sort of where reason has its ground in Heidegger. I hope that helped.
Yes, it helped. There's another question, okay, from Sebastián Buroncle. He's another student.
Thanks,
Okay.
Professor. Your paper. And one question I have is that insofar that comportment is analogous to a perception and that it must accompany all of their acts. In what ways does comportment manifest in angst and the ability to be in something? Or the inability of doing anything, of being anything?
Okay. It must accompany all my representations, says Kant. What Heidegger, and in breakdown, we're no longer talking about representations. We're no longer talking about trying to tie up contents of consciousness. But what the question implies is that in breakdown, we don't have a practical identity. So what is this self-consciousness or accompanying? And that's the key, I think, to this notion of breakdown. It isn't just a collapse of myself. It's a collapse of all my practical identities, and it reveals what selfhood is. So so in the Kantian terms, you would say like this apperception must accompany all my representations. In Heidegger, it's going to accompany both all of my, it enables my acting for the sake of being a teacher or a father or whatever, but it also accompanies a sense of self that I have in this, my sense of who I am in this breakdown. There's something that is constitutive of what it means to be Dasein, or what it means to be a human being, that goes beyond what it means to be a teacher or a father or football player or whatever. These are practical identities. So it's accompanying my all dimensions of what it means to be myself, my Dasein.
Okay, thank you. Maybe I can ask a couple of questions, Steve. So your reading of Heidegger's interpretation, your reading of Heidegger's reading of Kant, no, draws from two sources: the notion of pure sensible reason, no, that comes from the Critique of Pure Reason, and the other notion that doesn't come from the Critique of Pure Reason, but from the Critique of Practical Reason. No, the notion of normativity. Of course, you're interpreting Heidegger's, even Heidegger's being in time, and what it proposes, what it attempts, also drawing from his reading of Kant's Practical Reason, that the notion of norm. So on one hand, you have passivity, you have receptivity, you have answerability to something that regarding which you have to behave or comport. You have to be receptible. You have to. So this comes also from sensible reason, from this concept that for Kant reason is subject, depends to a receptivity that comes from nous, understood in a sensible way, no, in a Kantian way, intuition or sensible qualities, whatever. So there's this receptivity, answerability to, and then the question of norms. And then on the other hand, the answerability to a normative force. It's not something then that is generated by by reason, that from reason the norms do not generate, but they generate from this practical dimension, no? But this practical dimension, where does it come from? It comes from within Dasein. That is, there's on one hand norms, laws, etc., but where do they come from? And so Dasein is not only receptive, Dasein has to determine itself, because if not, I mean, what is the difference between inauthentic and authentic existence? Dasein has to determine itself. So he doesn't talk about will, no? He talks about feeling, but there's resolution, no, in being and time. So this normative force that you're talking about, that has to do with a change from inauthentic to authentic existence, this self-determination of the Dasein to set himself as ground, as no, that's what you have no told us. It comes from within, no. So it's sort of a law that is constituted from within, but not from reason, separated from feeling or from what's within existence. And so that's how finitude comes about, no? Because this ground is not, it's vulnerable, no? That's what you're trying to say. But there are two questions then. So there's passivity, there's activity or determination that comes from within, not losing oneself in the world, but from within, no? Self-determination. But then the answerability only to oneself or also to others? First question. Second question, you're talking about care. Okay, but in being and time, care itself, what is care? Ultimately, it's time, temporality, being and time. I don't know. What do you, I don't know if I have read your text adequately. I don't know what you think.
Let me, I think you have read it very accurately, so I'm not, I just want to qualify certain things. I mean, care has a temporal structure that I didn't go into. We would have to discuss this. But I don't think anything I said contravenes that. I think that all of the discussion that I've laid out in terms of practical identities all involve various dimensions of temporality, and care is always, as it were, ahead of itself, is simply a way of saying that I am projecting on possibilities. When I'm acting for the sake of being a teacher, there's a dynamic that's basically the Aristotelian dynamic of the Hu-Henneka, for the sake of, namely that I'm ahead of myself because I'm always acting for the sake of what's coming, what is what I am to be, right? Or how a teacher or mother acts in a certain situation. So, but at the same time, I'm always current. There's a now moment to it because I'm succeeding or failing at what it means to be a teacher from moment to moment. It isn't decided at the end. It's not like making a house where you know, you've got a bunch of steps, and then at the end, you've either made a good house or you haven't. You're always in the process of trying to be a teacher and succeeding or failing at it. So I think that the temporal dimension fits the Aristotelian model here. Maybe not the Kantian model, but Aristotelian model. As to being answerable, am I answerable to others? My claim is actually that that's the kind of answerability that I have. I'm not really called upon. I don't call upon myself to answer for myself, except derivatively. Others are in the world, and that's what my point is, that answerability here is the root notion of reason. I'm offering, because my actions in trying to be a teacher or a mother are guided by what I take to be best in that situation. I don't have a guarantee that it is best. It isn't grounded. There's no knowledge that could substitute for that being an issue. That's what meaning is. It really isn't, you know, what does it mean to be a mother? What does it mean to be a teacher or a student? I mean, it isn't given in some particular place. What we do have is public norms, right? Public norms that are there, and they say, you do this if you're a teacher, you show up to class on time, you give grades. What if I say, I don't think that's what it means to be a teacher? And people do say that, right? They say, I'm not going to use technology. I only believe in face-to-face talking, you know. That's a stand you're taking. That's something that you hold to be what is best in the manner of teaching. And so there's plenty of room for critique of social norms. But it's not that as you're basing that critique on some principle of sufficient reason that only I know, you know, or I could give you a complete account of why it's better to have face-to-face meetings or whatever. No, it's just that this is how I hold what it means to be a teacher. That's what I hold it to mean, and I stand up for it. But that doesn't mean that, what does that mean? It means when somebody else, it doesn't mean that I'm just right. When somebody else has a different view of teaching, I owe them my reasons. I owe them reasons for why I think it's best to go on in this way, even though they're finite reasons, right? And I also owe them, this is what it means to be answerable to people, right? I also owe them an ear, that I lend an ear to their reasons and weigh their reasons against my reasons. This is, I think this follows directly from what Heidegger is saying, although a lot of people think Heidegger has no room for reason whatsoever, except as this kind of derivative thing. But it seems to me this follows directly from what authenticity means and how the way he presents this breakdown, which tells us what selfhood without any qualification, that is, no, I'm not a teacher, I'm not a policeman, I'm not this and that, I'm just a self. That's what that section tells us. And so that's how I would, now, that's why it's interesting that when Heidegger introduces this kind of stuff in Kant and the Problem of Metaphysics, he turns directly to the acting self. He doesn't talk about the pure apperception. He talks about the acting self that feels itself in its actions. And so I think he criticizes the Neo-Kantian view of the primacy of theoretical reason as a model for cognitive, a model for human reason, and moves to the practical side of it. And so he wants to put both of those things together, I think. Thank you.
Yeah, it was very clear of your talk. Thank you very much. Okay, so I think we are already quite late here, no?
I'm sorry, the paper was rather
Yeah.
long, I apologize. but
I'm
thanks.
very sorry. Yeah, it's for you, it's I think 7:26. For us, it's 8:26 in the evening. So I thank you very, very much, Steve. It was an honor to have you here with us in our 20th anniversary and also the 300th anniversary of Kant's birth.
Yeah.
And well, thank you very, very much.
Let me just say thanks to all of you, and Rosemary particularly for the invitation. So
Yeah, thank you.